I'm back with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Mike, we've been hearing from the Biden administration that the great threats facing America today are coming internally from white supremacists, or if they're coming from anywhere else, it's these generic threats like climate change. But it seems to me that if you look around the world, we've got some national actors, and specifically China, that have very ambitious global aspirations. And so let me start by asking you, what do you think is the greatest threat facing America today?
So the greatest threat, Dinesh, at home, obviously, is a weak America, divided America. But the biggest external threat, by far, is the Chinese Communist Party. It is the only entity today with both the capacity and the intention of undermining our way of life, property rights, the protection of human life, all the things that the rational thought, all the things that the West has built an edifice around. They want to undermine that. And so this is an easy answer. It's the Chinese Communist Party. They are big, 1.4 billion people in the country. They are powerful with an economy that is very robust, and they will stop at nothing to continue to build out their hegemonic power. We don't have to study long. Just listen to what General Secretary Xi Jinping says, the leader of the CCP. And when you listen to him, you will come to understand that this is something that the United States has to push back against. It has to counter forcefully.
Now, would you say that when I think about the old Soviet Union and I compare it with China, the Soviet Union, I think probably in numeric terms had a larger nuclear arsenal. And of course, we heard a great deal about that in the 1970s and 80s. The Chinese, however, are a lot wealthier. And as you mentioned, they have an economic juggernaut that would be able to fuel their global aspirations, perhaps even more than the Soviet Union. We've heard from military strategists for a while that the Chinese don't care about that. They don't have global objectives. Their objective may be to be the big boy in the neighborhood, to push their weight around in the South China Sea, perhaps exercise a certain kind of intimidation over Taiwan, maybe scare away South Korea and India and a couple of other players. But they're not trying to be a global superpower. How do you read the intentions of the Chinese, and are we in, you may say, a new sort of Cold War?
Dinesh, they're very clear about their intentions. They want to be a global superpower. This is their objective. And they'll use every tool. So I understand why the military folks talk about the fact that the Chinese military is focused on the first island chain and then the expansion of their power. But there are other tools, their information campaign, their propaganda campaign around the world. Indeed, right here in the United States, massive spying operations that forced us to close the Chinese consulate in Houston, Texas. Their economic tools, right? Stealing intellectual property from us here in the United States, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of wealth destroyed, and then dumping that product back here inside the United States. No, this is a nation that views itself as an empire, right? Historic Chinese, right? The Middle Kingdom. So they want to be at the very center of the world. They want the rules to be their rules. You see it in the way they're creating their digital currency now to try and take and replace the dollar as the reserve currency around the world. These are all focused efforts of a Chinese Communist Party that is intent on having the capacity to influence every country around the world, dominate those that are weaker, and coerce those that are a little bit stronger.
When I asked you earlier about the threats facing America, the first thing you said was actually not China, but the kind of division and weakness and sort of lack of will inside of the United States. It looks like the Chinese are now aware of this and perhaps even trying to exploit it. I think, for example, of the Chinese diplomats who confronted the Biden diplomats, and the first thing they said is, hey, you can't lecture us about human rights. You admit that essentially you've got all this institutional racism and white supremacy in the United States. So why don't you put your own house in order first and then start lecturing? So I thought it was interesting how well the Chinese were able to play that diplomatic card and how befuddled the Biden people were, because in a sense they were being incriminated by their own testimony.
Yeah, no, Dinesh, the problem that the Biden administration has with that line of argument from the CCP is that they believe it too. Right? They believe this is a racist nation. They believe our founding was illegitimate. They run around the world apologizing for America when we're the greatest force for good in all of history. And so, yes, so the CCP will exploit that. you hear CCP diplomats talking about Black Lives Matter. You see them make references to the murder of George Floyd, right? You see that. And as America's chief diplomat, I saw around the world, it wasn't about traveling there to go make friends with them. We needed to be clear. We were working for America first. We were going to put the priorities of keeping our citizens safe and free and prosperous first. And when we did that, we were going to deliver the goods for them too. And if you don't understand, if you can't see the absolute absence of any parallel, any moral equivalence between the United States, with all of its challenges, between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, then you are doomed in your diplomatic efforts around the world. You can't deliver it. And the CCP will exploit it. They'll tell every country around the world, look at those Americans. Look how messed up they are. You should be with us. We're the strong horse, right? This is a Middle Eastern idea of the strong horse. We're the strong horse, and America is in decline. I fear that the left in the States believes that. They believe that this was a ill-founded nation that is now in decline, and we're just going to try and manage our way through that. I don't accept that premise. I think they're fundamentally wrong. And that really is the hallmark of the difference between how we thought about America and its place in the world and how this administration does.
Let me ask you finally about the role of radical Islam in this picture. Do we have a separate threat coming from radical Islam that is distinct from the Chinese threat? Or is it the case that America's enemies are somehow making common cause with each other? My wife Debbie is from Venezuela, and she notices, for example, that you got the Chinese in Venezuela, but you got the Iranians in Venezuela. And in some senses, they appear to be allied, at least allied in their opposition to the United States. Talk for a moment about the sort of Chino-Islamic alliance and say a word, if you will, about Venezuela.
So that's a good point. I talked about this in Venezuela. You have the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians, the Cubans, of course, in Venezuela, running a police state that's destroyed millions of lives and caused over 10% of the Venezuelan people to have to flee. It's a calamity. I think there are ideological differences between the Marxist-Leninist views of the Chinese and the Islamist views of these extremists in Iran. But suffice it to say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend certainly works there. But we see it not just in Venezuela. Look at the Iran deal. The administration wants to go back into this failed nuclear agreement. The Chinese want to go back into the deal. The Iranians want to go back into the deal. The Russians want to go back into the deal. And the Biden administration wants to go back into the deal. This ought to tell you something about how those countries are prepared to align in ways that undermine the United States of America. And so the Chinese are expanding in these Islamist places. We have a threat that is certainly separate from Islamist terror, but one that will certainly, what's a polite way to say it, play footsie with the Chinese and vice versa when it's in their common interest.
Just one more question if we have time, and that is, you mentioned, this kind of peculiar fact that the objectives of the Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians coincide on the Iran deal with the Biden administration. Now, it would seem to me that this would give some of these hostile foreign powers a reason to want to interfere in American politics, because one party is more aligned with where they want to go in the world, and the other party, is the Trump party, let's say, is clearly not. Do you believe that these foreign actors have these objectives of meddling in American elections? And if so, is that something that needs to be more carefully looked at?
Dinesh, they absolutely do. They have preferred candidates, parties. They have things they prefer that America did. And you can coerce it with your military, or you can conduct information and propaganda campaigns around the world and inside the United States to undermine those beliefs, those parties, those principles that make life more difficult for you if you're the Chinese. They are fully engaged in the propaganda war here in the United States. We see it in our universities and schools. We see them stealing research from them. There's 360,000 Chinese students studying in the United States of America on any given year. So yes, they are working to conduct information campaigns. And by the way, they coerce, we've seen this, Dinesh, they coerce American businesses as well. So it is a multifaceted effort to shape American culture and American politics and American thinking, in an effort that is much more in line with the things that they hope to achieve around the world. So this is an easy question. The answer is yes.
Mike Pompeo, thank you so much for this. It's been very insightful and a little bit sobering. I appreciate it.
Dinesh, thank you, sir. So long.